was a dark week for Israelis and Jews around the world, possibly the darkest since October 7th. 6 Israeli hostages, none older than 40, who survived almost a year in captivity, executed by Hamas. Massive protests erupting in Israel calling for a hostage deal now, but the way forward remains unclear. We will talk about all this. Our hearts undone by this week, but at least we'll talk about it together, so that might bring some comfort. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy, 2 Jews on the news, and as we approach that anniversary of October 7th, I think you're right, Yonit. In some ways, this has been the most somber and sort of bleak week since that event, and we'll talk about exactly why that is. And I do think it was one of those moments where Israel and diaspora both went through this, again, for quite specific reasons, which we'll talk about, but it sort of comes as people, the end of summer, the return, the Chagim, the major Jewish festivals are approaching, and in the beginning of September is always a very particular time in Israel. I'm just, you tell us about how these moods have, there's the confluence of moods this week.
I mean, this week saw the return of kids to school, as you say. September 1st was a Sunday. We should mention that doesn't include high school students because teachers are on strike, and at least 20,000 students in Israel from the north and from the south are not opening their school year in their own towns because they have been displaced. But the school year did start. And, I was walking my youngest to first grade, and that's usually such a happy occasion, and everyone is supposed to be excited and elated, but no one really was, because the night before, the terrible news broke that 6 Israelis who had managed to survive for 11 months in the most terrible conditions were executed by Hamas. And so what you had around you was people walking their kids to school, and you look around and first grade, this is my 3rd time, so I know that it's always a little bit emotional, and you see the sort of teary-eyed parents all excited, their kids transforming from kindergarten kids to school kids. And this time there were tears in their eyes of all the parents, but it wasn't due to this. It was just terrible sadness. You'd asked me on that day, you asked me how I was doing, and I wrote back one word. I wrote broken. I think that was the mood. Everyone was kind of lingering on in the classrooms because the moment they kind of stepped out, they would return to this harsh reality that we were all confronting on Sunday morning.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few elements. If you were explaining to someone why this had struck particularly deeply, it's not as if hostages and bodies of hostages have not been recovered before. Why this one? I think it is the fact that it is known that they were murdered, shot to death just before they were found. These weren't bodies found after many months, or perhaps even from October the 7th. They were young. I mean, the oldest among them was 40, most in their 20s. You're talking about people sending their kids to school. These people seem like kids, and they were, whether they were at the music festival or elsewhere, these were young people. And I think we'll talk about this, the sense that all of these deaths have been needless, of course, but the notion that these were avoidable deaths, that these needn't have happened, that actually maybe even a matter of a different decision taken a matter of hours earlier, maybe these young people would have been coming home and alive. And we should say about the circumstances, our understanding is that Hamas shot them in this way in the tunnels because they feared that the IDF were coming and were very close, and therefore they were about to be rescued. So that notion of how close they came to surviving this ordeal, these are people who, videos of them had come out a matter of months earlier, that people knew they were alive. All these elements combined together to mean that even though hostages, their deaths have been announced before, somehow this landed much more sharply. As somebody wrote to me, a punch upon a bruise, quoting Evelyn Waugh, the notion there's already pain, but this was further pain.
Yeah, and I think you explained it really accurately why we felt this way. It's a week in which You know how when you have a second child, you can't imagine before that child is born how you would ever love someone as much as your firstborn. And then you realize love is elastic. It can expand. It can, stretch to hold all of this. And sadly, we kind of realize this the week where pain is also elastic. It needs to stretch. And we have, you know, the feeling is that every time you kind of get hit on the head by reality, October 7th was the first time. And then ever since, it happens again and again. And you need to kind of piece the pieces of your heart back together and glue it back together. And this week was a week in which at least I kind of looked at those pieces and said, I can't now glue it together yet. And I can't carry on yet. The pain of this, the fact that these were civilians, they were kidnapped either from a party or from their house. Carmel Gat was kidnapped from her parents' house in Kibbutz Be'eri. They survived the most terrible conditions. Obviously, they were tormented and starved. We know now that Edin Yerushalmi came back. Her body weighed 36 kilos. That's 79 pounds. This is what they went through, but they survived. And they could have been rescued. Carmel Gat and Edin Yerushalmi and Hersh Goldberg-Polin, which we will talk about in a few minutes, they were on the humanitarian list. They were the first to come out if a deal had been struck. And that is the sort of feeling of it was so close. We could have been there. And they were executed by this terror organization. So it's just really a terrible, terrible heartbreak. We should talk a little bit more about them, I think. Alex Lubanov, 34 years old, was the manager of the bar at the Nova. He had 2 children. One of them was born while he was in captivity. Almog Sarusi was 27 years old. He was with his girlfriend Shachar at the party. She was shot. He tried to save her, and he was also murdered. Ori Danino was 25 years old. He managed to escape from the party. He came back to save others and was murdered. Carmel Gat, who, every hostage who came back and met her said that she was a ray of light. She helped them with yoga and meditation while in captivity to help themselves. Again, as we said, she was on the list and she could have been released very soon. And Edin Yerushalmi, 24 years old, a bartender at the party, just someone who came there to work, was kidnapped. And as I said, they found her body and she weighed 36 kilos. Her sister, Shani, was interviewed on Channel 12 a few weeks ago, and she said, when my sister comes back, I'm going to be so embarrassed because I'll think to myself, how is it possible that it took so long for us to bring her back? I'll be embarrassed to say I owe her forgiveness. All of these families, just think how tormented they are, that they feel like they did try to do everything and it failed. And they keep saying this, we are so, so sorry. I don't think they're the ones who should beg for forgiveness. There are others who should, but that's what they feel.
This was a theme of many of the eulogies and speeches given at the funerals that went on all week, this notion of apology and forgiveness. And we're going to talk about it, but words coming back to me from the mother of one of those hostages, the mother of Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who we spoke to by coincidence. We replayed the interview just last week with her, that extraordinary conversation. But one of the things she did say was, if we don't bring them back, what does it say about us? It will haunt us. And she didn't mean her own family. She meant the Jewish people, in a way, Israel, the wider society. And so that's been an undercurrent through all of this. I mean, one thing you wouldn't volunteer it yourself, Yonit, but I think it's worth explaining to listeners when we're speaking about this feeling, which is these families, their stories have been told often to you, that you are anchoring the nightly news on Channel 12, and in that role you have been speaking to family members, relatives, siblings, parents of these hostages. You know each one of these individual cases. This has been something I would say about you, which is, in the absence of the political leadership doing this, of sort of guiding the country through it and consoling them, I think a lot of this has fallen on you to be the person as a sort of vessel for the nation's feelings. A nation that has been looking for somebody to help them with this. I mean, they turned to Joe Biden, famously the sort of mourner-in-chief in America, given his own experiences of grief. But in Israel, the political leadership weren't doing it. And I think a lot of it ended up, falling on you. And you've had to sort of carry this for a long time. And so when we're speaking about these individual cases, it's not only as a sort of journalist reporting names. You do know these people, you do know their families.
I mean, all of us, look, this is, as I have been telling you more than once, I think, over this past year, there's no guidebook for journalism and how to do this, this story that keeps on. It didn't end on October 7th, obviously, and all of us, all the journalists in this country have been following the families closely, and really, I think emotional ties have developed because that is the situation we are in. I was anchoring from the protests that erupted, spontaneously after the news broke, and on Sunday evening there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis all over the country, particularly in Tel Aviv, protesting and calling for a deal now. And I was talking to these families that I've known for almost a year. And you see these people, Jonathan, the anguish, the urgency. They understand that their loved one can be next. And the families of Carmel Gat, who her cousin was talking to me, off air, and he was saying, we're tormented. We can't sleep at night thinking what we could have done more. And asking why other people in the country and the politicians don't seem to be as tormented as they are. So yes, there are bonds that have been created between, us, the people who do the news, and these families. And I think in the case that is sort of the maybe symbol of that is the story of Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who is one of those hostages that was murdered. Hersh was a 23-year-old kid, and we spoke to his mother on this podcast, to Rachel. It's a remarkable conversation because she's a remarkable woman. And you saw that moment, the day of the funeral, thousands of Israelis from everywhere around the country, coming to this funeral, because this story touched their heart so much. This is a kid who wanted to go to the party. He went there with his best friend, Anil Shapira. They hid in a sort of safe area, or tried to hide. Anil was throwing back to the terrorists. The terrorists were throwing explosive grenades, and he was throwing them back. He managed to throw out 7 until the 8th killed him. Hersh watched as his best friend was murdered. His own arm was blown off, and he was abducted. We saw those videos, and we saw his parents, crisscrossing the globe trying to save him, and they almost made it. That thought that kind of couldn't leave my head this week is that when they spoke at the DNC, Rachel and John, he was still alive. I mean, and that is the most heartbreaking thing.
When the politicians were meeting to discuss whether or not they would accept this deal, he and the others almost certainly were still alive then. We don't know the exact timing. The point about the fact they were invited to the convention goes to something wider, which I was going to say, which is you describe, and I've been very moved seeing those pictures of all these thousands of people gathering in Jerusalem, this sort of snaking procession for him. This was not just an Israel phenomenon. This was global. To the English-speaking, anyway, Jewish diaspora, there were at the start hundreds of hostages. In some ways, it's invidious to talk about one that somehow emerges from all the others, because all of these hostages will have stories and personalities and biographies that are very moving. His story touched the English-speaking Jewish diaspora for one very obvious reason, which is that his story was unfolded and spoken in English, and therefore people could follow it. A lot of the stories you've been having on your nightly broadcast haven't reached the Jews of America or Britain or Canada or South Africa because of the language barrier. But this story cleared that barrier because people heard the parents speaking in a language they could easily understand. And that was, even in the funeral, there were those eulogies delivered in English. And so that, just on the most basic point, connected. And I think there's something else as well that ensured that this family earned this sort of very particular place in the hearts and in the concerns of people all around the world. And we heard it in that interview we did, you and me, with Rachel, which is this extraordinary humanity, this compassion, and her ability, even as she was going through unimaginable agony, to empathize with those on the other side of this conflict. And she had talked early on about her knowledge that there was a mother in Gaza who would look like her, be like her, who was going through some of what the pain she was. And at the DNC in Chicago, John Goldberg-Polin, the father, speaking, saying there is this surplus of agony in this war that doesn't just take in one side or another, but all of us. There's too much. I think that enabled a whole lot of people who otherwise might have said, well, yes, it's terrible what's happened to the hostages, but, there are tens of thousands of Palestinians dead on the other side. It enabled them to see the humanity of this one family and this one person and connect with it. So I think for all kinds of reasons, but I think for those two particular reasons, this was a case that went far beyond. This was a story that went far beyond Israel and touched hearts way beyond that one country.
The story of his life and in a way the story of his death is the connection, is exactly the bridge between Israel and diaspora. He's 23 years old. His family made Aliyah when he was 7. His father, John, speaking in his funeral, was telling the story about when they came to Israel. And he said to him, Hersh is a name that might be a little bit challenging for Israelis. Maybe you should want to become Tzvi. It has the same meaning. And Hersh himself said when he was 7, I'm Hersh. Israelis will deal with that. Everyone knows who he is today. He was right about that. This is a family. I feel the need as a Jerusalemite to tell the story that they come from a neighborhood called Baka. Baka is a neighborhood in the south of Jerusalem, which is a diverse neighborhood and includes this sort of. The people who live there are what is becoming a rare breed here. They're dovish and liberal, but they're also religious. And that is the community he grew up in. His room, famously has this sign that says Jerusalem for everyone. He was a fan of Hapoel Yerushalayim in basketball. This is this kid and this is this family. And you talked about what kind of family they are. I have to tell you, I came to pay my respects together with thousands of Israelis in their Shiva this week, their community I know well. And I have to tell you 3 things that I noticed there, Jonathan, just to show, what kind of family this is. First of all, the numbers. Remember, they both had, and everyone around them had numbers of the days that Hersh was in captivity. 332 is the day of his funeral, but they continue to wear the sticker with the numbers, meaning we are still in this battle. We are still in this fight. There are 101 Israelis, and we need to get them out. So the numbers and the sort of ticking on the clock is continuing for this family. I think that is important. I think it's also important that in the tent, the huge tent that is where the Shiva is conducted, there are mourning notices for the rest of the hostages that were murdered with Hersh. This is their story as well. And the final thing I can tell you about that tent is that there's a large picture of Hersh there, and posted to it is a note in handwriting. I assume it's his mother or his father. And the line there is a line from the book of Samuel. And the line is, for this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. If I may also read it in Hebrew, because it's written in Hebrew. It's a heartbreaking little note that is stuck there between the thousands of people who are coming to visit this family and to pay their respects.
It's very moving hearing that. I mean, the notion of them still wearing the number even after he is gone reminds me of one line from the funeral oration that Rachel delivered, where she said, and she repeated the word, perhaps we'll hear this bit actually, where she says, "You are finally free."
Okay, sweet boy, go now on your journey. I hope it's as good as the trips you dreamed about, because finally, my sweet boy, finally, you're free. I will love you and I will miss you every single day for the rest of my life. But you're right here. I know you're right here. I just have to teach myself how to feel you in a different way. And Hersh, there's one last thing I need you to do for us. Now I need you to help us stay strong. And I need you to help us survive.
So you hear that, and her saying, you are finally free. But you don't feel that they as a family can be free of this thing because of the pain of it, and because, as you say, the ordeal itself is ongoing for these other families that they are so close to, and for the country. And so there was something even of a hope and a prayer in that sentiment. Let us be free of this, and the country is not.
Yeah, I mean, there's another line that struck me listening to Hersh Goldberg-Polin in the funeral. She said, I don't remember if you remember this, she said, I was privileged to have the most stunning honor to be Hersh's mama. And that line, lingers in my head. It has been all week. Because when you think of the Ten Commandments, right, it says, honor your father and your mother. They add the addendum. That's the only commandment that has that your days may be long upon the land. But she talked about the honor of being his mother. And this is so much the person that she is. She turned that phrase, the commandment, into something else. And it catches the light in a different way. I think there's a power there in this family, and particularly in her, the spiritual power that manages to transcend the moment. This is why these very private people, he's an entrepreneur, she's an educational advisor, but this is why they are admired throughout the world, because they manage to do something that's very powerful, to take, you listen to them. Every time you listen to her, you're changed by her. You are made better by her. And I think that is an incredibly powerful thing. And it, they are harnessing that to try and help others inside this terrible pain that they're in. I think it's utterly remarkable.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think they signaled that they're not going to stop, that they are going to continue. For Hersh's legacy, that they are going to continue. And in a passage which also leapt out at me, because I thought it was going beyond the immediate moment, and saying that in keeping in the spirit of what he believed, their son, that they want a way out of this conflict. Again, this surplus of agony. There is too much pain, too much bloodshed on both sides. They don't just speak narrowly of their own, but of the two sides in this bitter war. And they say in the bit that was most sort of obviously political in that funeral oration, perhaps we can hear that.
But you're a dreamer, an expansive thinker, so you would keep on pushing for a rethinking of this region. You would say, you have said, that we must take a chance on a path with potential to end the ongoing cycles of violence. You would ignore people's public posturing and what people say at press conferences, and you would push every decision maker to truly look themselves in the mirror and to ask themselves selflessly every single day, will the decisions I made today lead to a better future for all of us? And you would tell any decision maker who cannot answer that question with an emphatic yes to step aside.
That was the message there. If you're not in the business of ending this horror, both in terms of bringing the hostages back home and really ending the conflict itself in the largest sense, then make way for someone who would. And so that was the political sort of passage there, but I felt it was very, the focus was personal, the focus was emotional, but inevitably, because of the fact that all of this was intertwined with a decision made by the Israeli government, that's what had brought tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Israelis out onto the streets. The sense that in some ways, as I said before, this was not an unavoidable series of deaths.
There's a lot of sadness and a lot of rage among many Israelis. You see the polls, the recent poll that we published a week ago, saying that 56% of Israelis think that a deal should be struck, and it should be struck now. Now, of course, the enemy that Israel's sitting across couldn't be crueler, right? And they are playing Israel and Israelis with everything that they have. But the question is, does Israel, or is it morally obligated to bring these people back, the people you can bring back? And that question has, obviously been laden with even more made heavier with even more urgency this week. And you see the Biden administration losing its patience, the president saying what he has refrained from saying thus far, which is asked if he thinks Netanyahu is doing enough. He says one word, no. And many in the Israeli public feel the same. They feel that this government doesn't have a sense of urgency. Maybe the only one who does is Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and all of the heads of branches of the defense echelon. And Netanyahu now, essentially, after this protest, after the funerals, doubling down and saying, we need to stay in the Philadelphia corridor. That's the corridor essentially through which many of the arms were smuggled from Egypt to Hamas. And we have to do that. Hamas is saying, if that is what you are, if that is what you are insisting upon, then there's no deal. So that is where we are, where, we're almost a year in, and there are 101 hostages still held by Hamas.
You say that the sadness and also rage, I confess myself, I moved very quickly towards the latter. Because obviously the rage you feel first is to the people who did the murder, the Hamas fighters, men who shot these 6 hostages. But the political decision that was made that said, yes, there's a deal on the table. Yes, the defense minister thinks I should take it. Yes, the security chiefs think I should take it, but I'm not going to take it. I cannot help but feel anger to the prime minister who made that judgment call. And I've been thinking as hard as I can about whether there's any case you can make. And I came across the argument this week that somebody said, look, maybe there is a really hard case that a leader could make in a situation like this that says, this is going to be the most painful thing I will ever say to you, my fellow countrymen, my fellow citizens. But we have been vulnerable to hostage taking because we place such a great value on the lives of hostages and that we're prepared to give up so much to get them back. Famously, 1,100 Palestinian prisoners, including Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, in return for one Israeli, Gilad Shalit, back in 2011. We're too vulnerable. We have to now steel ourselves for the idea that we are not going to bring them back, because if we show the enemy that we will sometimes let go of our hostages and not bring them home, then they will not use this tactic against us. So, imagine the speech. My fellow Israelis, we are going to have to let these hostages die so that future Israelis are not taken hostage. Just try and imagine that speech and then think to yourself, why is it that Netanyahu cannot make that speech? The 2 reasons. He's saying not just that this point about the value of hostages, but also because there is now this other goal, which is the sacrosanct, sacred goal of the Philadelphia corridor, which a certain Israeli TV journalist made the point this week that this has not been mentioned before. It was not one of the original war aims. It was not part of the terms of the deal that Netanyahu reportedly accepted at earlier stages, whether May or July. It's only now that he discovers this holy grail principle that can never be compromised. That makes you doubt its sincerity, first. But the second thing is, there is no moral authority this man can draw upon to make such a statement to the country. There is no trust because of the cynicism and the divisiveness by which he runs the country, in which he pits Israeli against Israeli and Jew against Jew. I was imagining in my mind, could a Yitzhak Rabin type figure, or going even further back, Ben Gurion himself have made that speech? Maybe, but it would have been very, very hard. But I'm afraid Netanyahu is the one person who cannot make that kind of appeal to his countrymen. Instead, the assumption is that this is yet another ploy, a cynical, bitterly cynical ploy, to prevent a deal because, and I'm weary even myself of saying it because I'm such a broken record on this, He does not want a deal because a deal means the return of the hostages, which means the end of the war, which means elections, which means a commission of inquiry, all of which, at the very least, risks his hold on power. And therefore, his message to Israelis, if he was truly honest, would be, I will let these Israelis die so I can stay in this chair. And that is completely unpalatable and explains why I think many Israelis moved so quickly to rage.
They're really heavy and difficult questions here. And the problem is that this conversation, not our conversation, but the public discourse, is imbued with so much politics and vitriol and resentment. Let's just take the example of the Philadelphia corridor. Obviously, there is an issue there because weapons were smuggled from Egypt to Hamas. Obviously, it is important. But what you have from the one side is the prime minister saying this is a cardinal existential issue, which you understand to be an exaggeration. And on the other hand, and we should say this too, Jonathan, all of the security defense establishments saying, don't worry about it. We'll figure this out. If we leave for the 42 days, which is the first stage of the hostage deal, we'll manage to get back in Philadelphia if we need to. But these are also the people who told Israelis that Hamas is deterred before October 7th. So it makes sense why some Israelis worry about trusting that. And if you zoom out from the whole thing, where are we really? We are standing, after almost a year, across from the cruelest enemy you can imagine. Right? This is a terror organization that kidnapped civilians, held them in torture for almost a year, and then executed them. I saw these headlines over the world. Hostages dead. No, it wasn't a road accident. It was Babi Yar. That is what this enemy did. And you need to understand, all of us, that obviously this enemy can't be standing after this war. That is obvious. But this enemy also abducted Israelis, so it will have this insurance policy. Now, it's a serious question. What do you do? And for this serious question, you need serious people to have this discussion. But it's very difficult when all of the discourse is taken over by, do you love Netanyahu or do you hate him? The tragedy here is that it's not a serious conversation that is happening. And these are serious questions that I don't know the answer to. I don't know if I answered anything of what you were trying to say, but this is just what I feel this week.
Yeah, I think the point is there is a way this could be changed, the tenor of the conversation. Because, I agree with you. I think there is a legitimate debate because, A, the credibility of the military when say, don't worry, we've got this, is strained given October the 7th. And also, I think it's a relevant precedent that after Oslo, equally, the Israeli military said, yeah, if we need to go back into the West Bank, we can. And then 20 years ago now, 20 years plus, in the Second Intifada, it took a long time to go back in and deal with the threat that was posed out of places like Jenin and elsewhere. It's not, that you could
1,500 Israelis murdered in those terror attacks,
and
right?
it didn't have, so these promises that it can be done straight away, I get that. My point is, the one person who can't really make this case is him. The only way he could change it is if he truly believed it was this cardinal existential thing. He could say, don't make this about me. I am going to step down from office as soon as, put a date on it, November the 1st, whatever it is. This is just something we have to do. It's not for me to stay in this chair. I am leaving this job. I will face the consequences in court. But as a custodian of Israel's security, I am saying we have to have this Philadelphia corridor. Then maybe you'd listen to it. As it is right now, no way am I listening to it, because this is a guy who comes up with new cardinal, existential, sacred principles every day, as the way other people change their socks. It's whatever keeps him in that seat. And he is exploiting, I think, and really manipulating the deep-seated, completely understandable angst and fear that exists among Israelis since October 7th. And then many Israelis who will feel, I used to trust the military when they told me things were doable. I can't trust them anymore because of what happened after October 7th. And I think Netanyahu is trading off that. and exploiting that. So I'm afraid his motives are completely irrelevant here, because they go to whether or not he can lead people with him in what is an unbelievable ask, because he is, let's not mince our words here, he is saying, let us forfeit the lives of those remaining hostages in order for this other military goal that I have set out. I mean, that is asking a lot of his country, and I don't think his country is ready to give it to him, and so that's the standoff we're in.
Yeah, I think we should probably add just something that Netanyahu conducted two press conferences this week in Hebrew and in English, both explaining his logic behind the Philadelphia line. In his press conference in English, Dan Williams of Bloomberg asked him, you said in April that Israel is a step away from total victory. And this is what he said. I think it should be quoted word for word. What I meant to say was that we were a step away from the critical thing that will pave our way to victory. I didn't think we could have this victory if we didn't go into Rafah, and withstood quite a bit of American and international pressure to go into Rafah and Philadelphia. I thought there's no way we could end it without it. So that is to our discussion about where Israel is and where Israelis are at this point. I would just say very, very sad and very, very confused.
Meanwhile, the rest of the world is bound up with all of this and involved in it. Just a couple of developments I think we should register. One here in the UK, it's still a new government, the government of Keir Starmer, announced that it was suspending export licenses for a limited number, I think around 30 of the 350 arms licenses that it grants for export to Israel. First thing to say about this, timing absolutely terrible. The timing of the announcement came exactly as the funerals were going on. I think possibly even the funeral we've been talking about was happening while the Foreign Secretary David Lammy was on his feet. That's just appalling timing, and I think conditioned partly how this has been received, which is by Britain's Jewish community extremely badly. The chief rabbi, who doesn't make political interventions all that often, denouncing it, saying it's incredible that a government would do this while Israel faces war on 7 fronts, etc. Just I think some background to this that is just worth explaining, because I think people have just thought, all right, that's it, it's now a pro-Hamas government in London. That's really not the case at all. My understanding of this is that the government feared they were imminently going to lose a case in court because the decision to sell would be judicially reviewed, and that had they lost in court, they would have been required to take much more severe action. Their room for manoeuvre would have been much more limited. They may, in other words, have had to suspend many more than just 1 in 10 of these export licenses. This way, they felt they kept the initiative. Their argument is the law is the law, and a process of review that was set in train by the previous Conservative government looks at this war in the round and has to make a judgment on whether there is a risk of human rights violations or violations of international humanitarian law on 3 measures: the conduct of the war itself militarily by the army, treatment of civilian population, treatment of detainees. Really interestingly to me, no judgment was found against Israel in terms of the military conduct of the war. There was no sort of black mark against Israel on that. Instead, it was, and we've talked about it many times, on this issue of humanitarian aid and food, and that the assessment was made there was at least a clear risk. And the second thing was on treatment of detainees. And I understand the story that we talked about a lot on the podcast about Sde Teman and the reported alleged abuses there, very violent and distressing abuses that we talked about. Those left the people who took the decision, they believed, with no legal room for manoeuvre in saying that there was not a clear risk that detainees would be mistreated. They believed that event at Sde Teman meant that a court in Britain would overturn the government's action and say there was a clear risk. In other words, they felt really boxed in. You have a lawyer who's the head of this government, a former prosecutor. They feel they cannot do anything other than comply with the law. Within those constraints, I think their view is they did pretty minimal stuff. They're certainly getting huge heat from anti-Israel groups, pro-Palestinian groups who say they should have done much more. And I think I would just direct you to the statement made by the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, Britain's first black Foreign Secretary, incidentally, announcing himself as a Zionist. Now, saying, I am a Zionist, I believe in Israel's right to defense. Maybe a lot of Israelis would just take that, and move straight past that. I'm telling you, that is a big deal. To use that word, it's become very charged. In Britain, I think it would be a big deal in other places too. It was a big deal that he did it. They're getting a lot of heat from people who are anti-Israel. I say all that just really to give some context to what I think on its face has been spun as, it's now, the pro-Hamas government in London.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about just the timing of it was terrible.
Yeah.
And in Israel, and again, to the extent that any Israeli had the bandwidth this terrible week to deal with anything else, the fact that it came out, I think you're right, and this was streamed live internationally and of course in Israel, as the funeral of Hersh Goldberg-Polin was actually happening. I mean, Israelis were pretty shocked by this. The rest of it, I hear what you're saying, but that was the only thing that Israelis were hearing this week. As we are on the topic of mentioning other things in the world beside what is happening here, although this is terribly connected, isn't it? Is the shooting at a shooter that came to the Israeli consulate in Munich. We're talking on Thursday. This happened on Thursday morning. He was there, but we have to say that the consulate was closed because it was the anniversary of the Olympic massacre of 1972, when 11 athletes were murdered by Palestinian terror group Black September. So he didn't manage to do this. What we know is it's an Austrian man. He's 18. Again, this information is coming out right now as we're recording. We don't know much more. But it's very, very clear that the way that this conversation is happening, the way Israel is vilified on the international stage, leads to these kinds of actions. And the fact that the consulate was closed in this sort of coincidence or tragic coincidence of history saved many people, probably. But just, to think of the fact that this is what is happening, that was 1972. We're in 2024, and just to think, we're still dealing with the same things, only it seems worse.
And I do wonder to the extent to which that was wholly a coincidence. We don't know. I mean, but just it is odd that it should be on the very day, 52 years on. Just staying with Germany, in a normal week, not that we either of us remember those, but I think it's possible we might have led our episode with conversation about these results of regional, state elections in Germany. For the first time, the far-right Alternative for Deutschland party, the AfD, won one of those, and really convincingly in the province of Thuringia, top of the poll, emphatically. That's new territory for post-war Germany. I won't repeat the mistake one news organisation did of saying this is uncharted territory for Germany. Unfortunately, it is all too charted territory for Germany. But post-war Germany had placed a kind of exclusion zone around the far right, and that has been breached in many ways. This is one more of those breaches. I think if we're they may be, despite that emphatic victory, kept out of government there because they will still need coalition partners. And just as in France, people did not want to partner up with Le Pen, for now, it's like holding back the flood. The dam is holding so that these far-right parties are kept out of government because all the other parties club together. But I do wonder how long that will take. As we both know, sometimes politicians get desperate and pick far-right coalition partners for their own purposes. And therefore, the idea that forever the far-right will stay out of power in Germany or in France, it's a worry. So, those developments in Germany. And I saw one commentator make a good point, which is so much of the rhetorical fire from diaspora communities in recent years, actually, has been about left anti-Semitism. Among left parties or among the pro-Palestinian movement, and it's right to look at that. But let's not forget the sort of OG version, the original form of anti-Semitism from the white supremacist far right. It is still there, and they had a big step forward in Germany this week.
Gosh, aren't we cheery this episode? We apologize to our listeners. Maybe just to make everyone feel better, a Mensch Award could be thrown into the conversation, Jonathan?
We could do that. Why don't we do that? I will do a little mention. We're going to have our Chutzpah Awards as well, which could be another buzzkill. So apologies in advance. But yes, a little mention en route to that, because route being an appropriate word, actually, which is the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, Muslim mayor, often gets a lot of heat in this kind of discussion, announced that some cost a new bus route in London. Now, normally we don't go to that level of local news on Unholy, except this is something that
actually we do. Long-time listeners will know we do.
We sometimes do.
Okay.
The Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in London has long pressed for a route that would link the two big Haredi communities of this city. I'm in one of them. That's Stamford Hill in northeast London, and Golders Green, famous Jewish community in northwest London. It's a hassle to get from one to the other at the moment, and they've long been a demand. Why don't we have just one bus that can take us? So behold, the launch of the 310, a new route that will link these two Jewish communities. It's a small thing, but it was hailed by Sadiq Khan as being a gesture to a community, he said, that needs it. And I think there's probably a safety dimension to it too. It's easier if you're just on one bus rather than having to change in various places. Less risky. But I think a good thing, a mention for Sadiq Khan for the new 310 bus.
And I want to, if I can, throw in another Mensch award for this week. It is to swimmer Ami Dadaon. He won a long line of medals for Israel in the Paralympic Games. He has cerebral palsy. This week, he won these medals. And when he won the gold medals, he was singing the national anthem, the Israeli national anthem, in such a beautiful way. And Israelis were sort of very moved by this, and it was very needed in a week like this one. I would want to add something, just because I think this episode was deeply depressing, because I found myself this week kind of searching for something to be comforted by, and I called at some point. I called a friend and a colleague of ours. At some point, I called a friend and a colleague of mine, a correspondent in our network, Yael Odem, who's been sort of in direct contact with all of the families for such a long time. And I said, give me a story. Just tell me something to make me inspired. And she reminded me of the story of Osnat Peri, whose husband, Chaim Peri, was kidnapped, and he saved her. I mean, he went first to the terrorists, and then they didn't see her. But she is also the chair of the kibbutz of Nir Oz, the black hole of October 7th, the kibbutz that no one arrived at. The military took a long time, the longest time to get there. And minutes after her husband was abducted, she started setting up the sort of command center of the kibbutz to try and find out who was abducted, who was murdered, who survived. And this is what she's still doing. She is working on rebuilding Nir Oz. And I'm mentioning this particularly this week because I think we should remember, that even though everything seems so dire this week, that we have this immense strength, us Jews and us Israelis, to manage to get up even after we've been punched in the gut so severely. So I don't know if any of this made sense, but just to kind of remind us that, we are stronger than we think. So after saying that and establishing that, let's move on to the Chutzpah Award.
Well, the Chutzpah Awards we will try and dispatch with brevity, because we don't want to let that colour the mood. And I think the thought you've just given us is the one that we want to take away. I would hand the Chutzpah Award to Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, who now does his own thing on social media. He hosted as his guest a so-called historian who, by the name of, let's not even name him, who he said, is going to say lots of brave things, including about the great taboo subject of the Second World War, and proceeded to just get into what I think would be categorized as a form of Holocaust revisionism at the very least, saying that poor old Nazis, they launched this war and they were completely unprepared to deal with all these prisoners of war, and they couldn't feed them, and so they thought it would be more humane to kill off these prisoners of war rather than letting them starve. This was his version, I think, of what you and I would think of as the Holocaust. Obviously, it wasn't prisoners of war; it was men, women, and children. It's sinister that this kind of view is getting a mainstream platform. Tucker Carlson should not be platforming these kind of people. I'll just mention this. I knew about this because the algorithm on X offered this up to me. I don't follow Tucker Carlson. I don't look at his posts. But there it was, when front and center, when you opened up the app, this was what was there. This is what Elon Musk is urging his audience to look at. And in fact, he himself did a promotional tweet of it saying, very interesting. This is where we're at. So chutzpah award for everybody involved in that sordid little saga. I'm struck by your thought that some people, though, are good at finding causes of joy and celebration in the midst of all this darkness. I think our chutzpah award maybe goes to people who tried that themselves.
Took it a bit too far, yeah. If we're doing double awards this week, so just to the some members of the Israeli coalition in a week like this, which was incredibly bleak, celebrating at a wedding of a daughter of one of the, we should say, important political operatives of the United Torah Judaism, knowing full well that the celebrations or the smiles or drinking of alcohol, all of this is photographed, and still not minding. This was Monday evening. All of the hostages were laid to rest between Sunday and Monday. And Monday evening, Israeli coalition members celebrated in this wedding. Just the optics of this are terrible. They are terrible. And if you want to show that you are not detached from the Israeli people, that is not the way to do it. I fear that we should have ended on the Mensch Award and not the Chutzpah Award this week. But we want to, I guess, offer again sort of words of comfort, I hope, to our listeners that even through everything that happened this week and everything that has been happening for the past year, we know how to get up again. I think that's important to remember even in a week like this.
Yeah, I think that's the thought to guide us through the next 7 days, along with the hope that somehow there is brighter and better news. Whatever comes, you and I will be here.
We'll settle for mediocre news at this point, Jonathan. Mediocre news is also okay. Boring news.
Yeah, ordinary times is what we all want. We should mention perhaps that the US presidential debate is coming. You and I will both be up all night to do our day job. So we will do that. And I think we will speak a bit after the debate has happened.
Yep.
And people will be able to get that on the usual social channels. Maybe even we'll do a little mini one here, so people can pick that up. So that will be in the early hours, I think, of Wednesday morning, depending where you are in the world. Until then, why don't we say our thank yous?
A big thank you to Omer Primat and to Michal Porat. We have so many, what did you call it, social media channels, Jonathan? So you can check us out either on Instagram or YouTube or X, Twitter, our Facebook group, also Substack that Jonathan is checking out. And we will see you next week.
See you then.